Glasgow Arts Centre, mid-70s. Tom McGrath sits at an upright piano, rocking gently in his chair as he hammers out a strident modal theme over a churning bass ostinato. The theme has echoes of both Southeast Asian music and Scottish folk, its lyrical qualities emerging as McGrath softens his attack and lets his right hand dance freely. His right hand speeds up, unleashing a shoal of impressionistic harmonies across the keyboard. Once this passes, he breaks into a stride blues, exploding any trad jazz associations with gleeful splashes of dissonance. As his fingers scamper away, a vaudeville anarchism takes over. "Hey, come back here! Where are you going?" he exclaims. "Come right back here!" With a crash and a wallop, the music comes tumbling down. "Another fine mess," McGrath grumbles, like a Caledonian Oliver Harvey apprehended by the jazz police. The catchphrase is apt, given the fact that McGrath would have been working on his first play, Laurel and Hardy. Today, he's best known as a dramatist, poet, and cultural impresario. An associate of Alexander Trocchi and R.D. Laing, he was at the centre of the London counterculture, reading at the Albert Hall International Poetry Incarnation in 1965 and editing International Times for its first 12 issues. He went on to bring the spirit of the counterculture to Glasgow's pioneering multi-art space, the Third Eye Centre, which he ran from 1974 to 1977. In subsequent years, he wrote for the stage, television and radio, and helped nurture new talent through initiatives like Playwrights Studio Scotland. He died in 2009, at the age of 68. But while McGrath's literary and organisational achievements are widely celebrated, his musical activities are often overlooked. McGrath was instrumental in bringing Duke Ellington, Miles Davis and Mahavishnu Orchestra to Glasgow in 1973. Miles' sole comment to McGrath, "Nice suit for a white guy." And his early adoption of video has left us with remarkable footage of Derek Bailey, Brotherhood of Breath and Julius Eastman. That's all available at the Third Eye Archive on Vimeo and the CCA website. As a musician, McGrath was at the centre of a small local free jazz scene, alongside bassist George Lyle and drummer Nick Weston. They performed as a trio in their own right and backed visiting luminaries such as Lol Coxhill and Trevor Watts. Throughout the decade, others came into their orbit: percussionist Alex Jimison and John Fred Gilmore, multi-instrumentalist Alan Tall, saxophonist Tony Gorman and John Longbotham, and pianist Jim Vincent. Scotland has produced its fair share of improvisers, from Ken Hyder to Maggie Nichols, but they made their careers in London. The activities of McGrath and his peers show that the story of British free music extends beyond London, or even England. The biographical note for McGrath in a Scottish poetry anthology simply reads, "Explorer." The 1960s saw the boundaries between the art forms come tumbling down, creating a space in which adventurous polymaths like McGrath could flourish. Glasgow in the early 1960s is often characterised as a tough post-industrial city scarred by poverty, sectarianism and gang violence. In contrast, once stayed Edinburgh has its Cosmopolitan Festival, and the bohemian scenes are in Jim Haynes' Paperback Bookshop and the Howe Folk Club, which was frequented by people like Bert Jansch, Incredible String Band and so on. The East Coast city was inspiring to the young Tom McGrath, but as he noted in his 2000 interview with historian Angela Barty, who is currently working on a cultural biography of McGrath, Glasgow had its own bohemian subculture based around jazz, folk, poetry and art. Raised Catholic by Irish and Italian parents, McGrath found the cultural nationalism of the poet Hugh MacDiarmid and his Scottish Renaissance followers alienating. Modern jazz, beat and Black Mountain poetry became his great inspirations. Mainstream youth culture revolved around the dance halls, such as Green's Playhouse, which could hold about 4,000 people on its dance floor. It later became the Apollo, which is where Miles and Duke Ellington played in the early 70s, alongside all kinds of rock acts, Captain Beefheart, The Who, etc., etc. So in these dance halls, big bands performed jazz and pop hits to a largely working class audience. These bands provide an excellent training ground for jazz musicians, as well as future rock stars like Alex Harvey And in fact, we can take this right back to the 30s. As Kevin Legendre writes in his indispensable history of black music in Britain, Don't Stop the Carnival, Glasgow in the Edwardian times and the 1930s was an important place for black vaudeville groups to come through. Lots of big band swing groups. So the great Jamaican bassist Coleridge Good came to study engineering at Glasgow University in the 1930s and of course started playing as well, firstly in small groups before graduating to the big bands, and then the London scene where he went on to work with people like Django Reinhardt and Stefan Grafelli and become a key figure in modern British jazz with Joe Harriott and Michael Garrick, among others. But he, paid his dues, as it were, in Glasgow. And then more recently, the 50s and Next Generation, you had players like Pat Smythe and Bobby Orr, who also went on to play with Harriott and Good. As George Burt, Glasgow Improvisers Orchestra co-founder and mischievous guitar genius, notes the Scottish dance band scene of the 50s and 60s is not very well known, but a lot of these players were very good indeed and had a great deal of knowledge. Pat Smith and Bobby Orr, who played with Joe Harriott, came from that scene, he notes. The presence of US Polaris submarines on the Clyde provided a focal point for oppositional youth culture. An album of anti-Polaris folk songs, Ding Dong Dollar, appeared on Folkways Records in 1962, but the movement's soundtrack went beyond folk. When McGrath started playing jazz, piano in his early teens, the music was still part of mainstream culture. Although most of the clubs favoured trad and swing, he soon found fellow modernists to play with at the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament affiliated Saturday Late Club, which also had its Edinburgh equivalent during the Fringe. That's famously a really important space in terms of the sort of next generation of Scottish cultural workers coming through. Alistair Gray would perform kind of cabaret performances there, How to Build a Rhinoceros and so on. And many of those kind of key figures met at Edinburgh Late. And similarly, the Glasgow Club seemed to be really, there's less written about it, it seemed to be a really important hub for all kinds of arts in Glasgow. McGrath was also heavily involved with the Cell, a short-lived jazz club in the basement of the St Andrews Hall. The St Andrews Hall is now burnt down, but it's now the Mitchell Library, where the Mitchell Library extension is. In that space you had boxing matches, but also a lot of great concerts. Muddy Waters in the late 50s and John Coltrane in 1961. McGrath's jazz and poetry group caught the attention of broadcaster Magnus Magnusson, of Mastermind fame of course, who featured them on BBC Radio Scotland. The Cell also brought McGrath into contact with touring big band musicians who dropped by to play modern jazz late at night. It was really exciting what went on at that place, McGrath told Barty. There were some wonderful musicians around. A devastating fire ended the Cell in October 1962, but modern jazz continued informally in pubs, hotels and private homes. As creative as this era was, McGrath acknowledges a nihilistic side to the scene. It was all beat and no hope, and a bit of violence in it. The lure of London proved hard to resist, and in 1963, McGrath and his wife Maureen moved south, where the first of their 4 daughters was born. McGrath balanced family life with newspaper work and adventures in the nascent counterculture. He read at the Peanuts Club, an East End C&E night, frequented by the young saxophonist Mike Osborne, and participated in Mike Horowitz and Pete Brown's live New Departure events, which combined poetry and jazz, theatre and experimental composition. It's worth noting that Pete Brown and I think Michael Horowitz had first got to know McGrath back in Glasgow through stuff like The Cell. Pete Brown was really into the Glasgow and Edinburgh countercultural scenes and kind of helped spread the news amongst fellow kind of pop poets. Pete Brown, in case you're wondering, is probably best known as lyricist for Cream, but he was also heavily involved with the jazz and poetry scene before that. In 1965, McGrath performed at the International Poetry Incarnation at the Royal Albert Hall, as captured in Peter Hightwed's film Holy Communion, a key event in the advent of the counterculture. As he told Gavin Sellery in the Riverside interviews, the Albert Hall was a mind blower. It was such a huge event with all sorts of different styles. It had that political thrust as well, which is important. And you might be familiar with the famous clip of Adrian Mitchell reading Tell Me Lies about Vietnam. So that's a good example of that. Through Trocchi, whom McGrath had first encountered in Glasgow, he became involved in Project Sigma, an attempt to establish an international network of countercultural activism. After a 2-year stint at Peace News, where he was features editor, McGrath was invited by John Hoppy Hopkins and Barry Miles to edit a new underground paper, International Times. To IT, McGrath brought journalistic experience, a love of jazz and poetry, and a spot-on sense of humour. As Miles recalls in his memoir In the 60s, while he laughed, his whole face screwed up in amusement. His nose pinched at the nostrils, his eyes reduced to 2 slits, his balding pate shining. After the existential bleakness of the post-1945 years, McGrath welcomed the new mood. Suddenly God was back on the scene, he wrote in Scottish International in 1969. It was as cheap, as corny, as sensational as that. Yet it was sincere. But while he thrilled to the sounds of the underground, Cornelius Cardew, AMM, Pink Floyd and Soft Machine, McGrath never fully bought into the hippie dream. In fact, he sees the hippie thing as actually slightly later incarnation of the counterculture than the kind of earlier thing he was involved in. It's interesting if you read Mick Farron's memoir, Give the Anarchist a Cigarette. He refers to Tom McGrath being an old guy, even though he was probably only about 4 or 5 years older. You can really see how fast culture is moving and how quickly the almost kind of tribal alliances shifted or emerged. Although peace and love is part of me, I'd like to go with sinners, people like Trocchi and Lang, he told Sellery. But while the energy generated by Trocchi was intoxicating, McGrath felt there was a tyranny about the activities of these underground gurus. You get a good insight into the tyranny of these underground gurus in Jeff Nuttall's Bomb Culture, which has an account of a Project Sigma meeting, which McGrath and Trocchi and others were all at. And it basically sounds a bit of a disaster. And McGrath himself talks about it in his interviews with Sellery and others. He just ends up playing football with the kids outside while all the junkie authors argued. The junk habit was so entrenched, McGrath said about Trocchi and others. And he alluded to his own addiction in IT, issue 8. Heroin is a beautiful kick, he wrote, but it's insidious. It gets inside you and fills you with longing for more heroin. Ultimately, the pressure got too much, and in late 1967, a disillusioned and junk-sick McGrath escaped back to Scotland. When he returned to Glasgow, it was the last place he wanted to stay. As he wrote in 1972, it was that place where there was nothing happening. If you stayed in it, you were a failure. Glasgow was going through major social and architectural upheaval, with slum clearances and motorways cutting swathes through working class communities. The decline of major industries, like shipbuilding, reinforced a sense of Glasgow as a rundown and depressed city. Yet those who stayed were determined to make a go of it. A proposed arts lab, modelled on the multidisciplinary spaces that appeared in the wake of Jim Haynes' original initiative in London's Drury Lane, failed to get off the ground due to its organisers being, as McGrath recalled, too stoned. After getting clean in 1968, McGrath enrolled at Glasgow University, studying English and drama. Making contact with the younger writers like Alan Spence shook him out of his post-heroin funk. At 28, he felt part of an older generation and was struck to find that the new creative forms he had helped bring in via IT were an accepted part of life with this second wave of hippies. His flat in Bank Street in Hill Head soon became a gathering place for writers, artists and musicians. Ideas were shared and plans hatched. Inspired by the poor theatre, or theatre povera, of Poland's Jerzy Grotowski, McGrath formed an improvisational theatre group, The Other People, recruiting young writer friends like Spence, Gene Milton, and Tom Leonard, engineer Jim Torres, and musician and actor Alan Tall. While the results were, according to McGrath, terribly hit and miss, The Other People had an energy. Alan Tall, a rangy figure with a dry Glaswegian wit, was a folk musician who was kind of roped into The Other People as a guitarist, but he started to get into jazz via his associations with Tom McGrath. Tall went on to play with Dick Gaughan in the 80s and 90s. He's also a fine solo artist in his own right, but he's best known as an actor, working with radical theatre companies like Wildcat. In 1973, McGrath invited Tall to play guitar for Allen Ginsberg, an event which is captured on video. Over cappuccino in a Byres Road cafe, he tells me how McGrath hipped him to modern jazz. And discovering jazz through
Tom.
Yeah.
Basically, it was in Bank Street. The jazz discovery was him playing Charles Lloyd, and I said, "Who's that guy? What was that piano playing?" It was Keith Jarrett, early stuff. Okay, well, I liked that, and so I would hang out with him. And Tom had a piano, and I remember him and Nick and George playing, and me just attending. I wasn't playing any. I didn't play any horns. I think I might have played the flute a bit, but I was feared to take it up, because my head's always been far too diatonic for what these guys are playing. I mean, bebop, I have never been to that planet, I can't do it. And I've always had other things to do, putting in time learning all my keys, oh Jesus. I remember Tom would play away, and then the elbow would come in, and he'd play with the elbows, and he turned me on to Cecil Taylor. I thought, what the fuck is that?
So Alan Tall started dabbling in free jazz, free improvisation, and there's a video of him playing with the Andy Law Trio, a local group, recorded by Tom McGrath at the Scottish Arts Council Gallery, probably 72, 73. And it's quite a raw group. They kind of move between free improvisation and new agey folk. But there's some great squonking from the saxophonists, including Alan, and the drumming by Nick Weston is excellent, really holds it together while still being really fluid and open. And interestingly, there's a photograph of the guru Sri Chinmoy sat against one of the amps, and he was a hugely important figure, as we'll see. Tall was unmoved by his teachings. He referred to him as Sri Zambuk, after the popular ointment brand. But the spiritual leader was an important influence on McGrath and his circle. He was the guru to John McLaughlin and Carlos Santana, and he advocated a non-ascetic spiritual path, so basically you could smoke weed and drink, where followers transform the negative feelings standing in the way of enlightenment. So such approach clearly suited McGrath's jazz lifestyle and clearly influenced his work. A 72 profile in Scottish International describes a ritualistic performance that begins with McGrath and his friends sitting cross-legged, chanting Om, and leaving jazzmen and audience feeling a bit spare. McGrath asks everyone to put £1 on a tray, which he then claims he's going to burn. All people offer up are some theatre stubs. But the performance begins in earnest. After a quiet start, it explodes, and the writer describes it thus. He was off. Shouts, raspberries, howls blasting through the mic, the horns and drums, brass and whistles reaching an incredible pitch. In the spirit of Chinmoy's teachings, McGrath exercises and celebrates his demons. It's in these moments, the writer concludes, that McGrath feels the most alive. As he puts it, a kind of total psychic orgasm takes place. All the better, the more participate in it. It's tempting to read McGrath's mix of free jazz, blues and absurdism in light of Chinmoy's teaching. Far from undermining the enterprise, the humour breaks down inhibitions, clearing the path to enlightenment. His trio partners, Weston and Lyle, were fellow travellers. Indeed, they first met at a Chinmoy event in London in the 60s, but they wouldn't play together until they'd all settled in Glasgow in the early 70s. Born in 1939, George Lyle was a stalwart of the Scottish jazz and improvised scenes. In his later years, he became a key member of Glasgow Improvisers Orchestra, performing the likes of George Lewis, Evan Parker and Marlon Crispell. His final gig was in 2015 in a trio with his regular duo partner Fritz Welch and New York legend Daniel Carter, and you can get a CD of that on Neil Davidson's excellent IRAM label. Tall, leonine and laid back, Lyle was, in the words of his friend, writer and tight meat man mate David Keenan, old school hip. As a 1974 programme note puts it, Big George remembers when it all started. He's always been where the modern music is. A real cool player. Lyle began playing the bass at 16 and discovered the avant-garde via Schoenberg's piano and violin concertos. Moving to London in the 60s, he shared a house with fellow Scots Maggie Nichols and the bassist, tubist and poet Lindsay L. Cooper. He frequented the city's jazz clubs where he saw the likes of Joe Harriott, Tubby Hayes, Albert Ayler, Peter Covald and Barry Guy. While Lyle was playing regularly with friends, public performance is not a priority for him. I was there listening, as he told me, in 2015. He did play one gig at John Stevens' Little Theatre Club, the famous incubator of British free improv, but as he said, it was deserted. Lyle's social circle in London amazingly included Caetano Veloso and Gilberto Gil, then exiled from Brazil. I did play a wee bit with Gilberto Gil, he revealed. They were all amazing people, amazing. Nick Weston, who died in 2018, was a versatile drummer who worked in several idioms, but as John Gilmore argues, he was at his best playing free. Gilmore remembers first hearing Weston play in a late 60s soul band with jazz guitarist Jim Mullen and future average white band saxophonists Malcolm Duncan and Roger Ball. As Gilmore recalls, Nick was a very good looking guy. He had this huge Viva Zapata moustache at one time. According to Gilmore, Weston was briefly involved with Pentangle. As he says, Nick did some quite remarkable things, but he didn't really talk about it. A sensitive and exploratory rhythm unit, Lyle and Weston were involved in numerous projects in the 70s, including a soul band with Gilmore and various jazz formations with McGrath and others. With the addition of second percussionist Alex Jimison, the McGrath trio became Proprioception, named after Charles Olson's famous essay. As the 73 programme for Jazz in the Galleries notes, this music is totally spontaneous. Sometimes it works, sometimes we just have to keep playing until we find it again. And it suggests, the humour suggests the programme notes were written by McGrath himself. They have some presumably fake press quotes. This band's just ridiculous, claims Jacob Wally Steiner, jazz correspondent of the British Medical Journal. Meanwhile, Melody Maker's Richard Williams is simply lost for words. ... Alex Jimison grew up across the park from McGrath in Rutherglen. They shared a piano teacher, but they met at university. The relationship with Tom was very multifaceted, Jimison told me. There was a lot of far-ranging discussion. Having started out in the folk scene, where he met Alan Tall and John Martin, Jimison came to jazz via Bitches Brew and Mahavishnu. Although he continues to play, he now lives in France after several years in London. This was his only real experience of free improvisation. I remember Tom saying one time it had a real African feel, which is my thing really, and still is. There would be times when there was a very strong rhythm, and there would be times when it would be much more abstract. Proprioception mostly jammed at Tom's house, but they did make some public appearances, including at the 1973 Jazz and Poetry Festival at the Traverse Theatre in Edinburgh. And that looked like an amazing event. Featured Derek Bailey, Michael Horowitz, lots of interesting writers and poets, and jazzers, of course. And there are photographs of the event, and although Jimison is listed in the programme, it seems he didn't play the gig. He certainly doesn't recall it. And the photographs would suggest it's just a trio as well, with McGrath playing his Farfisa electric piano, which would certainly have had a really interesting and quite different sound. Recordings of Proprioception have yet to materialise, but we do have a live set by the Tom McGrath trio in the Third Eye archive. Now, when I wrote my Wire article, I'd suggested it was maybe 76, supporting Ken Hyder's Talisker, but it could be even as late as 91. The kind of clue is in them. They play a version of Carla Bley's and Now the Queen, taking it at a much faster clip than Paul Bley does in his better known version. But they make a reference to Carla Bley coming through now she may well have played Glasgow in the 70s or 80s. I don't have records of that. It's a great recording anyway, and you can really capture the range of the band. They go from kind of blues numbers and kind of bop into a much freer version of the Carla Bley tune, where you've got McGrath whooping and wailing while Weston sculleries around the kit. Lyle holds it all together with his recognisably driving, tremulous style. It's fascinating to imagine what this group would have sounded like, backing up people like Lol Coxhill or Trevor Watts. And Watts does remember playing with those guys. He said they were all good musicians with a great sense of humour. And Watts later took out Lyle on tour with his group Amalgam, filling in for his regular bass player. And there's some recordings of that version of the group on the FMR box set Wipeout. That's when they had Keith Rowe in the band, and it's a really wild electric free jazz group. Big favourite of Thurston Moore's apparently. Alan Tall caught that group in London, and his memories mental gig. A video of Birth supporting the Brotherhood of Breath at the McKellen Galleries in '74 is one of the most substantial documents we have of Glasgow free jazz. Now, this is a Nick Weston project, I understand, and it had a kind of shifting lineup. But in this one, it seems he was joined by George Lyle on bass, of course, Alan McFarlane on alto, Dave Finlay on guitar, and some other unidentified tenor and oboe player. The piece begins as a brooding take on Thelonious Monk's Round Midnight, moving out in a melee of jagged guitar and squawking horns. Lyle is a cyclonic force, steering the band towards a free bop midsection, before taking a stunningly clear solo around the 13-minute mark. His tone is huge with a woody depth and gutsy twang that perfectly complements the Charlie Hendon-esque duende of his melodic phrasing. Fritz Wells talks of Lyle being a very sideways shifting but grounded human presence when they played together in the 2010s, and that quality comes through in these much earlier recordings. So I've talked about those key players, but it's also worth mentioning the spaces they played. The Third Eye was hugely important. As Francis McKee, the director of its current incarnation, the CCA, puts it, Third Eye transformed Glasgow. It gave people a reason to stay. Opened in autumn '75, the Third Eye provided the city with a long-needed cultural hub. Occupying an empty storefront on Sauchiehall Street in the city centre, it was public-facing, with a cheap vegetarian cafe up front and performance space and long gallery behind. The villa further back, which is now incorporated into the CCA, housed Rock and Blues Club the Maryland and John Kraska's pop art design studio, the Artifactory. Its story begins in 1973 when McGrath became the Scottish Arts Council's Glasgow director, tasked with founding a new art centre. From his base at the Scottish Arts Council Gallery, McGrath edited Newspeak, a newsletter in which he set out his plans for the new art centre and promoted local events. With its irreverent mix of cartoons, listings and rambling editorials, Newspeak was very much a Scottish IT. In Newspeak 3, McGrath argued that art is the opposite of alienation. The Third Eye went on to forge an organic relationship with its locality, rejecting the elitism of scenes where art is something to discuss over cocktails. In McGrath's vision of cultural democracy, everything was valid. Jazz formed a substantial part of the Third Eye's programming, with Barry Guy, John Chakai and the Blue Notes among the first acts gracing its stage. And most of these shows were booked by Platform, which was founded in '73. Although it enjoyed the support of the Scottish Arts Council and Musicians Union, Platform was not unlike the jazz cooperatives emerging in the UK cities and regions. It took the form of autonomous local chapters rather than a central organisation, although they all worked together to book tours and so on. As Graham Blamire notes, the founding fathers of Platform Glasgow were drummer Bill Kyle, jazz critic, and the Cell impresario Jim Waugh and Tom McGrath. Their first show was from Don Weller's jazz rock outfit, Major Surgery, in April '73, but the real coups were concerts by Duke Ellington at the Apollo and Mahavishnu Orchestra at the Kelvin Hall. And there's a great account of that gig in Newspeak. There seemed to be a problem with the roof. It was leaky, so McGrath had to set up a tarp and then a complex system, kind of chain of people to inform the sound people were to basically turn off the electricity the moment a leak, the tarp gave way. This was all because Jan Hammer didn't want to get electrocuted, which is fair enough. It's also worth noting there were some other important events that year organised directly by the Arts Council, including the Miles Davis gig and what sounds like an amazing festival of avant-garde music at Partick Borough Halls, featuring Sonic Arts Union, so that's Alvin Lucier, David Beerman and so on, and Steve Lacey as well. Fantastic. And Instant Composers Pool were also booked, although it appears that show was cancelled. I could be wrong though. Platform showed its commitment to local acts with the first of its Jazz at the Galleries festivals in September 1973. These were held at the McClellan Galleries next door to the Third Eye. The programme is a snapshot of the 70s of the Glasgow scene, from the mainstream jazz of tenor saxophonist Frank Pantrini, who incidentally, his bassist Ricky Fernandez had a bit part in the Clark Gable and Ava Gardner film Mogambo, and he went on to be a much loved bass teacher to generations of Glasgow kids, including Alan Tall's daughter. You've also got the hard-blowing big band Bobby Deans, Bill Kyle and Gordon Cruikshank's jazz rock group Head, who released 3 albums and performed with Jack Bruce. They're the best known of the contemporary acts, but you've also got some intriguing jazz folk classical groups called Album, Syrinx, not to be confused with the ones who were reissued, the American group who were reissued a couple of years ago, Up and Gustavus Adolphus. So they all seem quite obscure, but I'm trying to dig up some more info on those. The bill was completed, of course, by proprioception. Platform's bookings lean towards jazz-based improvisation, but their modern music remit allowed for forays into the cutting edge of free music. One of its first shows was from Derek Bailey, who played Glycewood Square in '73. 10 minutes of this performance survive in the video archive, and they're extraordinary. Bailey coaxes ringing harmonics, behind-the-bridge pings and percussive sweeps from a prepared Epiphone 12-string, and keening alien tones from a Gibson Electric. Like McGrath, Lyle and Weston were mentors to younger musicians, bringing the likes of Tony Gorman and Jim Vincent into their world. A classically trained saxophonist and clarinetist from Greenock, Gorman was at music college when he met Weston through playing in a pub band together.
And a fella that I was at college with says, "Oh, I play in a pub in Paisley, the Abercorn, Saturday lunchtimes. And they need a sax player." And so I went along and I met Nick Weston. He was the first Glasgow guy. I was still living in Greenock, but
Right.
he was the first Glasgow guy that I actually met.
Mm-hmm. Oh, okay.
And through Nick, I met George, Lyle, and that whole scene.
Yeah.
And I would never have played in a jazz band if it hadn't been for George, because he'd just met Bill Kyle. And that's how I kind of met those guys. But I was like a jazz funk player with saxophone, or screaming David Jackson, Van de Graaff generator type. It was very gothic what we did. And at the same time, doing Stravinsky, at college. And so that gave me an imagination. By the time I moved to Glasgow, I was playing screaming kind of free solos. By visiting George, I'd look at his record. I'd look at his record collection and go, "Oh, well, who's this?" And he'd go, "Oh no, I think I've known you long enough." And so I heard Matt Coleman, free jazz.
Ah, well.
And then another time it was Albert Eiler. And he went, "No, I'm not sure you're ready for that yet." Because it was coming from quite a conservative Paul Desmond and prog rock. But George and I played every day, just played free. That's how I got into it.
Gorman, who now lives in Australia with his wife, the saxophonist Sandy Evans, continues to play despite being diagnosed with multiple sclerosis a decade ago. I spoke to him over Skype following a visit the other year to Glasgow, where he and Evans played a tribute to Lyle with Duo. A lively raconteur, Gorman gleefully recounts the 1979 filming of a BBC Spectrum documentary, which is BBC Scotland's arts strand, and it was later edited into an episode of Arena. So it's a documentary about McGrath, and although it's primarily about his theatre work, you get a bit of music in it as well. The end credits have him playing a lovely version of Coltrane's Naima over on a beautifully out of tune piano, and there's also a performance by the group in the third eye. So Born to Rave, Gorman's trio with Weston and Lyle were summoned to a recording at the third eye.
We turn up and Tom is the piano and poet, and they just want a thing with the band. And so, George and Nick and I, we just kind of wink at each other and wham! Off we go. It's just hell for leather. Like, for about 5 minutes, it was 10 minutes, and it's just then, and it stops, And the sound guy goes, that's great. Now we'll do it again, or cutaways. I went, what do you mean do it again? we couldn't possibly do it again,
So Gorman and Lyle went on to back Kenny Wheeler at the Third Eye in 1978, alongside pianist Jim Vincent and drummer Kenny Matheson, their bandmates in the hard bop-oriented Bill Cowell Quintet. The classically trained pianist's improvisatory flights didn't always meet the bebopper's approval, but Gorman was enthralled.
Because he was the one that showed me you could do anything. Totally anything. And people used to laugh, in the band. But he did his solos. He would come to the unaccompanied piano solo on his Fender Rhodes. But it would go from a bit of Chopin to a bit of, real elbows and the keys. And then back into the tune, and then he just threw the music in the air. His technique, imagination was phenomenal,
As Vincent explains via email, he now lives in Michigan, Wheeler was much more receptive to such gambits. There is one tune called Baba, a long, complex episodic piece with very complex harmonies. 6 pages long, so it's more than just a head. Halfway through the piano solo, Vincent lost his place. I went into a free-form thing to cover my embarrassment. Afterwards, when the interval came and we were standing at the bar, Kenny told me how much he liked it and how he thought it had resonances of Cecil Taylor. To this day, I think he meant it as a compliment. And it's worth noting that in more recent years, Jim and George Lyle were reunited. They did a collaboration via email, sending each other files to improvise over, and hopefully that music can come out properly one day. There's some really beautiful recordings there. Many of these partnerships continued into the 1980s. Gorman, Lyle and Weston joined John Gilmore in Dave Cruikshank's Afro-Caledonian percussion ensemble Atsamevu, while Vincent moved east, starting a free duo with percussionist Alan Pendry, who had studied with Tony Oxley. Gorman and Evans joined him for a gig as cadenza at the Haddington Festival in 1988. Now, if anyone had been to Haddington, it's a rather genteel East Lothian town, and its festival has a nice music festival, but quite genteel. But they got away with free improvisation, basically by making up a program with a series of tracks. So they could, basically the idea was, and now we'll play The Caves of Altamira, inspired by our drummer's recent visit to the famous site. And then they would just go into improvisation. But people seem to appreciate it because they go, oh yes, very evocative. I can see the caves. Between 1980 and 81, Toll had a residency at Cafe Theatre Space in the West End of Glasgow called Halaby's, inviting Lyle, Weston, Gilmore and Gorman along for freewheeling sessions. McGrath moved east, taking on a Scottish Arts Council role in Edinburgh in the early 1990s, and he gradually drifted away from the jazz scene. Yet he continued to play in theatrical context, and as his partner Ella Wildridge recalls, his final play, unpublished at the time of his death in 2009, it was about boogie-woogie piano players. Lyle and Weston remained lifelong friends, and John Gilmore's photographs capture their easy rapport beautifully. In the early 80s, their trio became a quartet with the addition of saxophonist John Longbottom, who just passed away 2 years ago. In a postscript to the Riverside interviews, McGrath discusses the quartet's 1983 residency at Halaby's. Their first efforts, he notes, were met with blank incomprehension. He goes on to describe his plans for the next performance. I have asked the musicians if they are willing to disassemble things, so that we can begin by playing separately, completely solo. Then, once the audience have been shown each musician, and each musician has been able to explore where he is at personally, we come together, but as separate entities, not as a jazz group in the old sense. By this point, McGrath, Weston and Lyle had been playing together for a decade, so such strategies were clearly an attempt to mix things up and break out of habit. He acknowledges that much of this had already been done by avant-garde musicians. The point is that we are trying to explore it for ourselves. McGrath expresses his desire to learn more from Derek Bailey, and these performance strategies may well have been influenced by the guitarist's company weeks. Theatrical techniques also appear to be in the mix, with the self-exploratory approach recalling some of his exercises with the other people. Rather than see this musical and theatre activities as exclusive, McGrath was interested in making connections between the forms. Whether he arrived at a new concept or not is beside the point. His activities showed that nothing was out of bounds for Scottish artists. Jazz, poetry, theatre, Buddhism, things that zap the mind, as he put it. He explored them all. Art, he wrote, is whatever you can get away with, which I love. But for all his individual achievements, arguably his greatest legacy is making that spirit of exploration open to all. As his credo for the Third Eye put it, put in place and let it happen. I think that's a beautiful sentiment. So I'm just going to try and bring the story up to date a wee bit. First of all, it's worth asking, did these gigs in the 70s inspire any younger players? Yes, is the short answer. So you may be familiar with Ivor Callan, great string player in the London Improvisers Orchestra, and he grew up in Glasgow and moved to London in the late 70s. But he recalls going to see Derek Bailey at the Arts Council Gallery in 73. He says at first he felt very uncomfortable. He didn't think he could hack it. But after 10 minutes or so, it started to work its magic on him, and his mind was completely blown. He said his life was changed forever. Ivor formed a free rock group called Gorilla Pike, kind of inspired by Beefheart, Can, Faust, as well as Glasgow's own brilliant prog jazz folk group Chow Parrot, who you should definitely check out. Ivor also talked about forming the Glasgow Musicians Collective, although it was just a one-off name because they needed a name to book a gig. But he talks about playing prepared piano, drums. I think Nick Weston's drum kit, funnily enough. I think at the Macallan Galleries, and that's a gig with his friends Alistair Dixon, Deeks and Jim. So Callan, interestingly enough, in one of these kind of weird coincidences, ended up being neighbours in London with Alex Jimison many years later, and they played together a bit, it seems. So after that, we've talked about the kind of 80s activities. The free players were still doing their things, but maybe kind of free gigs were harder to come by. Third Eye still putting on some amazing stuff. Platform booking the Sun Ra Orchestra for the Mitchell Theatre in 1981, and all kinds of other great stuff. Don Cherry playing in the early 80s. John Gilmore recalls hanging out with Don Cherry and Nana Vasconcelos, getting a berimbau lesson from Nana Vasconcelos, which is amazing. John got really into Brazilian music and built his own instruments. George and Nick also had a trio with John Longbottom after Tom moved east. Scottish jazz in the 1980s tended to get dominated by Tommy Smith, who was the kind of young wonder kid of Scottish jazz. He was sent off to America to study. And the scene kind of takes on that kind of neoconservative classicist approach, and the jazz education through the Royal Scottish Academy, now the Conservatoire, very much pushes that kind of classicist version of jazz history, but it's very music-y, and the music that comes out of that tends to reflect that, plays it fairly safe. So where do the weirdos go? Well, you've got people like George Burt and Bill Wells and Falkirk, who are kind of shunned by the jazz mainstream. They don't quite fit. I mean, they're interested in playing tunes, but they're also interested in freakier stuff. And they have to kind of find new alliances outside of the jazz scene. So that's really my argument, is where the interesting stuff kind of goes off into a different direction, kind of becomes separate from the jazz scene to some extent, which is not the case in the 70s. That, you know, the avant-garde and the mainstream can coexist quite happily with a fair amount of traffic between them. So Bill Wells makes alliances in the 90s with people like the Pastels, so on the more interesting fringes of the indie scene. You've also got more adventurous punks inspired by the X, Dog-Faced Hermans, Fugazi and so on, like Ger Reid, who are interested in improvisation through the groups like Dawson and so on. So you can start to see connections like that, and they start working with improvisers as well. There's also a kind of connection with the more kind of underground experimental noise electronic scene. Liam Stefani sets up his label and gigs, Scatter, the label mostly documenting gigs he put on at 13th Note and other venues. They're all up on Bandcamp now, Scatter Archive. And there's some amazing stuff there. Richard Youngs with Tony Bevan, an amazing Derek Bailey live recording, and Log Coxell and Pat Thomas in Glasgow. So there's all these kind of great, exciting gigs happening, and that clearly attracted people outside the traditional jazz field. This isn't to say the jazz world was completely cut off. Olive Millen, who was when she was directing the Glasgow Jazz Festival, would always find room for some more interesting stuff. But nonetheless, there was a clear shunning of the avant-garde by the Scottish jazz mainstream, which means they have to move underground, and that creates all these kind of weird alliances. But it also produces Glasgow Improvisers Orchestra. That comes together. You've got George Burt and Raymond MacDonald, the saxophonist, playing together in their duo or group, which also features George and other people, George Lyle, in the 90s. And that kind of feeds into Glasgow Improvisers Orchestra, which brings in all kinds of people, including some of these people from punk, electronic music, rock, and so on, as well as the classical field, and some jazzers as well, like Robert Henderson. So it's very cross-disciplinary improvising orchestra, and that's been an important hub. A lot of interesting stuff has come out of that, particularly smaller groups, such as Fritz Welch's groups with George and others. Neil Davidson, his solo material, his various groups with Fritz, like Aspira's Piss Raindrop, who you might remember from Tusk of Yore. So more recently, you've had Tony Bevan move to Glasgow. His informal events, Help Me a Melting, create a more kind of free, open space for improvisation. And it's obviously on hold because of COVID, so who knows what will happen next. But people are definitely trying to make things happen in the underground. The Scottish jazz scene is now kind of pushing itself with younger players who've come from the conservatory. But what I'd really like to see is to try and corrupt those players with some skronky goodness. So who knows what the future will hold, but it's fascinating to look back into these earlier sort of hidden portions of Scottish cultural history, jazz history, improv history, and find stories there that maybe haven't been told, haven't been fitted into the official history of Scottish culture. So I think it's really important to push those alternative histories and challenge our preconceptions about what Scottish music is. Boom.